Reverend Mark Chiang. I am ordained with the Presbyterian Church at St. Andrew's Presbyterian on 118th Ave. I also work as with the United Church Presbytery as LGBTQ missioner. And one of the things we're starting is a evangelical style worship service for LGBTQ people. For me, in my tradition, the question of homosexuality all comes down to what does the Bible have to say about it. And we wrestle, and one of the things we've been wrestling with from the beginning is our Judaic heritage that we have. What do we do with this law that was given to us? And the problem starts with Jesus, because he didn't follow the law all the time. And he made things difficult. So he's picking grains on the Sabbath, he's healing people, he's doing things he's not supposed to do. And so we would think, well, maybe the law doesn't apply anymore. So Jesus was challenged, and he said, no, I've not come to break the law, but to abolish the law, but to fulfill the law. Fulfill. And ever since we've been struggling with what does it mean for Jesus to be fulfilling the law, what does that mean for us? Do we still have to obey everything that's written in it? And the early church wrestled with this right at the very beginning. And it was one of the main issues when they were talking about the inclusion of Gentiles. So that's whether or not non-Jewish people could become Christians. At the time, everyone who was to become a Christian had to follow all the rules of the law. But the early church was obsessed with the same thing gay men are obsessed with, and that's got to do with the penis, whether it should be cut or uncut. And that was a big debate they were having at the time. So they wrestled with that question for a while. And at the Jerusalem Council, they said, no, look, we can't expect new believers to have to be circumcised. So we're going to just tell people that they need to not eat idol meat, not eat animals that have been strangled or blood. I think that's one of the early animal rights legislation, and to avoid, refrain from sexual immorality, which is, they don't really define in detail what that immorality is. I would love to know the details of what they're saying, but they leave it for us to wrestle with. And the early church is wrestling with that. At the beginning, there's one of Jesus's apostles, his name was Paul. He is talking to a crowd, and this is the main text in Christianity that is against homosexuality. It's in Romans 1. And you have to imagine that Paul is standing in front of something like a Donald Trump rally. So it's got all those sort of people in there. And he's getting them going, and he's saying, you know those people over there? The crowd is like, oh yeah, those people. It's like, they're awful, aren't they? They gave up on God. They've been doing terrible things. And the crowd's going, yeah, they're bad. They just started having sex with each other, men with men, women with women. It's awful. And the crowd's going, no, they're terrible, they're terrible. They're filled with malice, greed, conceit, and murder. And now like the crowd's like foaming at the mouth. And Paul pauses and he says, you're no better. None of us are following the law. We all break it in some way. And if you're going to start judging those people down the road, you better be judging yourself even more. So that's the second chapter of Romans, and he goes on to talk about us being a people living in grace. Yeah, we have this law, but we don't necessarily follow it, and we are filled with God's forgiveness, and we are all to love and not judge each other. And it's wonderful stuff. And you think that after that passage, we shouldn't be debating this law anymore, but it's not quite as simple as that. A lot of the Christian debate focuses on the first part of Paul's argument, forgetting the rest of it. But we are really still arguing and wrestling with what we do with this law. It's not so clear-cut. Some Christians like to look at the Levitical law and say, well, there's different types of law in that text. Some of them are ceremonial, meant for the temple. Some of them are civil laws, meant for the Israel nation at the time. And some are moral laws, like the Ten Commandments. And like the Ten Commandments, eh? No, you don't want to murder people. That's a good law. We should keep it. So we want to keep the moral laws, And often Christians will throw in sexual references in the Bible as part of that moral law. I question whether or not it belongs there. And sexual immorality is, again, not something really well defined and something we each need to wrestle with. But Christians will say, well, it's hard to understand things by the Old Testament, but again, we follow Jesus who fulfilled the law, so we have to go back to whatever the New Testament has to say. And the New Testament references include the one of Paul I just talked about, but there's also one in 1 Corinthians and another in one of the book letters of Timothy. And there's debates about whether the word Paul is using really refers to gay and lesbian relationships today. It's not a term in Greek that is found very often, except for Paul's writing there. And it's suggested by some scholars that this is not about relationships. This might be about temple prostitution or about the sexual ethic of Roman society at the time. And doesn't apply as much today. But it's not, you hear some people arguing against Christians that, well, you don't follow all these other laws, so why are you following this sex law, this law about homosexuality? But unfortunately, to use that argument is not so simple, because we have this long history of wrestling with the law. We have different ways of understanding it. So what do we do? I think a better argument to be given for the inclusion of gays and lesbians in church life is what convinced Paul and the early church back in Acts. For them, there's a story of Peter, he has this dream, and God lowers this blanket, and there's all a bunch of animals he's not supposed to eat in the blanket. And the voice from heaven says, kill and eat. And Peter says, no, I can't eat this, it's unclean. And the voice says, don't call unclean what I've made clean. The dream happens 3 times, the blanket coming down. Peter's all confused. He wakes up and he's invited immediately to go to a Gentile's house by the name of Cornelius. He's recently become a believer and he wants to be baptized. So Peter goes over there, ready to tell them that, well, you need to be circumcised first. And he's standing in the room and he sees that these people are filled with the Holy Spirit. There's a faith that's alive and genuine. And he says to himself, well, if the Holy Spirit is already here, who am I to say no? So that was a turning point for him, same turning point for Paul and that Jerusalem council. I think it's still the most powerful argument today. For me, my turn, I grew up in a very conservative family and agreed with everything my family told me about homosexuality. For me, the turning point was going to a metropolitan community church in Toronto, and that's a gay and lesbian church. And I was standing there, and when they started singing the Lord's Prayer, it was just so powerful for me that I broke down in tears, and I realized that, no, the Holy Spirit is here too. So that's the sort of work that we're trying to repeat now with Haven, the evangelical group we're starting, trying to just be a witness that you can be gay and a person of faith, and it's both a genuine faith and a genuine sexuality, and they're both good. I think having the personal witness is more powerful than anything else. We have in Christianity a number of denominations now moving towards the acceptance of gays and lesbians. The United Church was one of the early ones doing it. My own denomination, the Presbyterians, are debating it now. The Anglicans, the Unitarians are doing it long ago too. Others are just starting to have that conversation. For some it'll be about the Bible, for some it's going to be church tradition and teachings as well.